Welcome to Zip Code Zero. While all eyes were on Congress this week, the Republican presidential primary continued to unfold across the country. I've personally found that primary a little bizarre and a little boring, especially the last debate. With Trump ahead by 40 or 50 points, it seems like the race might already be over, but I have been wrong about Trump before. So, to bring in some outside perspective, today's guest is Taylor Svehlak, a friend of the show. Taylor is a gun rights advocate and an old school conservative, though a bit of a classical liberal in the tradition of Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill. Taylor and I discussed the recent GOP debate, the state of the race, what the general election might look like, and some of the main issues on voters' minds this election. Speaking as someone who's very much on the left, I always think it's fun to discuss politics with people outside my own bubble. So very much appreciate Taylor coming back on the show and sharing his perspectives. As always, please remember to hit like, subscribe, and share the show. Enjoy. Did you happen to watch the debate?
I did. I made it a point, or I have made it a point this election cycle to stay as far out of the horse race stuff as possible. But I finally gave in and broke down and watched this one. And it wasn't as painful as I had expected it to be. I think if the current, at least if the polls are to be believed, I think if the current front runner were there, that would be a different case. But
Did you like anyone on stage?
That's a hard definition to come up with. But yeah, I was surprised by Ramaswamy. I realize that I firmly believe he's just Andrew Yang for the Democrat or for the Republicans. But I thought Ron did a good job. I thought he did a good job of knowing when to attack and then also knowing when to be when to essentially tell the moderators, hey, we're not going to bicker amongst ourselves. I thought that was kind of impressive for him. I understand why he's doing it. He wants to make himself look like the clear choice for frontrunner. But then outside of them, I loved poor Burgum. I loved his responses to a lot of the questions. I feel bad for the guy because he needs to understand he has no chance in hell at this point.
I can't remember anything he said on the debate stage.
He had a ton of really smart answers, none of which got any amount of audience energy or excitement, and they were all very. It's almost like someone asked him a yes or no question, and he answered yes, and then was done. That's not really what happened, but he just had very correct and non-emotional answers, and that's not what a debate's for these days, or ever really.
Would you have gone to the debate if you were Trump?
No, he's got nothing to win going to the debate, in my opinion. If he could somehow just have an amazing performance and he could guarantee that he'd do really well, sure, but he would know showing up that everyone on that stage outside of Nikki Haley is just going to be coming for blood, and they're going to target it right at him. And I don't think he's got anything to gain by going to the debate. And in fact, if you look at polling numbers, everywhere outside of some of the early Iowa polling shows that not going to the debate's not hurting him either. So
yeah, he's up by 40 or 50 points in the primaries, so there's
exactly
virtually no point in him going. Are there any issues besides firearms that you're looking for the candidates to talk about on the debate stage?
Definitely. Just to be totally candid with the audience, I am absolutely, and will admit it all day long, a single issue voter on firearms. But yeah, there are definitely some other stuff. There are definitely some other things that I was paying really close attention to. I'm very much curious how every candidate is going to tackle ESG issues. I think that could be very interesting. I also recognize that I'm probably not the best conservative in that respect, in that I don't think most conservatives even know what ESG is. I think they just think, well, that's woke, and they kind of end it there. I'd like to think that I am curious about some of the deeper aspects of that and how various candidates are going to combat or at least address ESG and the excised impact that ESG investing in particular has on things like freedom to choose, market alternatives, online censorship, stuff like that. Another issue was I was very interested in seeing how the candidates tackle trans issues and LGBTQ plus stuff, because I think that's going to be one of those things that really separates the men from the boys. Not to use a politically incorrect phrase, I think that the more hesitant candidates that won't really stand a chance of winning, not that any of them do really, I think they'll not even talk about it. I think some of the other candidates, one of the things that I respect about Ron was he's absolutely willing to go to battle and that sort of stuff, and Vivek too in that respect. I think their willingness to talk on it says more about them as a candidate than their actual plan. I think most Republicans right now would just avoid talking about it altogether because the Republican Party for the past 30 years has been, it's kind of been a neocon tradition to say, hey, let us go bomb some brown people, steal some oil, and cut taxes, and you can do whatever you want domestically. We don't give a shit. And I just really, I think it means a lot when a new conservative, if you will, is willing to go up and say, no, look, I don't care if you call me a insert, expletive here. I'm going to talk on these issues and I'm going to have a stance. And if you don't like it, then don't vote for me. That's fine. So that's another thing I was looking out for. And then outside of
I
that,
feel like they all. Sorry, go ahead.
and then the only other thing I was going to add was immigration. Not because I necessarily think that I have a great plan for it, but because I'm genuinely interested in hearing what everyone else's plans are for immigration, because it's such a sticky issue at this point. I live in Texas. I'm the only person in my neighborhood that speaks English as a first language. Half of my family are Hispanic, Latino. Like, it's an interesting issue, and especially in my neck of the woods, it's one of those ones where everyone kind of accepts there's not a good answer. Like, we just got to figure something out. So,
Yeah, I feel like it was interesting you said online censorship because I feel like that is a big issue that has been coming up. There's actually a Supreme Court case that I think they're hearing in October that has to do with the ability of state governments to basically throw people off social media if they don't like their accounts. Or maybe it's about, I could be getting that wrong. Maybe it's about social media companies doing it on their own under the guise of content moderation. I think it gets back to when they threw Trump off Twitter. And I have noticed that's become kind of an issue where the Democrats are pretty big on what they call content moderation, which I think goes way too far. And the Republicans are pushing more for, I think, just the guise of free speech. On the immigration issue, so you said you don't think there's a good solution for it. There was this article that I was reading, an op-ed by Fareed Zakaria in the Washington Post. He was talking about this idea of suspending our asylum laws because I think the majority of immigrants that come across the border claim asylum, which they're legally allowed to do. I think they
yeah.
cross the border illegally, but then they claim asylum and then they get a court date in like 2 years and they're allowed to go into the country.
Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, is that a possible solution that you think could help? Because it seems like an abuse of the asylum situation is something that is at least incentivizing a lot of people to come across the border.
Yeah. I think it absolutely does incentivize people to come over. The issue at hand is, number one, I don't think getting rid of our asylum laws would be morally or ethically the solution we want to go through with. I think amending them,
Well, just
obviously, would
suspending
make a lot of
them.
sense. See, that's another one where I think we could tighten them significantly without completely suspending them, and it would probably have pretty much the same impact. I think the main issue here is whether we have the asylum laws in place or not, 11,000 people are coming over every day. And whether, even if none of those 11,000 get a court date, you're not going to catch and deport 11,000 people times 365 days. Like, that's simply not going to happen. It's an issue that is so incredibly huge that I don't think we have even, you go back to like the Gang of 8 days, and there's been a proposed solution that would genuinely change things enough to like solve the problem. I think we need to start thinking in such a a substantially more holistic way. And I also think one of the questions that was posed during debate was, essentially a few years back, there was the idea floated of a path to citizenship. And, I think it was Governor Christie in particular, did Governor Christie, would he still support that now? And Christie's answer, this is one of the few Christie answers that I was actually like, oh yeah, no, that actually kind of makes sense, was it doesn't matter now. Like that was at a point where we were seeing on the hottest days, 3,000 people. We're at 11,000 people per day now. And now that as a bargaining chip in the process of like getting immigration reform passed is completely off the table. It's not even, yeah, it has to be thought of in the context of the overall solution, but that's not going to fix the problem either now. Like it's too far gone. Essentially, we've let the grass fire, go up into the forest.
Why do you think the Democrats are not really touching the issue of immigration? I was looking at polling. It's the number 3 issue in a recent Harris poll that voters care about. Number 1 and number 2 are inflation in the economy, which you could argue is the same thing in a sense. So it could be the number 2 issue. And to your point, there's 11,000 people coming a day. I think we're on a record for almost 3 million border crossings this year, or maybe it's the next fiscal year, because I think they record those in the government fiscal years. It's an issue that I thought it was clever of Governor Abbott to send migrants to New York and DC and Chicago and blue cities. I think it's a little fucked up in some ways, but it definitely caught the attention. Like in New York, they are against having more migrants come in. Like Eric Adams said, we're all filled up. It's costing them billions of dollars. Same thing in cities across the country. And I was recently looking at this interview that Bernie Sanders did in 2015, where he was asked about immigration and allowing sort of a better, more free flow of immigration. He was against it. And this old sort of classic working class left perspective that it hurts working class communities. And he said open borders are a Koch brothers dream because it's just cheap labor. And there used to be an issue on the left, and then it somehow just stopped becoming an issue. And now if you talk about it, it's just you're accused of racism or xenophobia if you raise an issue of the border. What do you, as an outsider to the left, what do you think happened to the Democratic Party where they shifted that quickly to they won't even talk about it now?
I think you nailed on the head. I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, the Republican Party has gotten so, deaf to accusations of racism that we don't care anymore. You're going to call us racist no matter what. You're going to call us sexist. You're going to call us whatever. I think that the Democratic Party, however, like that word still has a lot of pull. And if you are, say, here's like the far most progressive leftist in Congress, and here's the most like red state Democrat. If you're dead here in the middle and you support immigration reform, you're still going to be called a racist by both of those people. And now at this point, like Republicans are so tired of it that we'll be like, yeah, no, we'll call you racist too. Why the fuck not? Like, it's not going to, you're going to call us one. I think among Republicans, like, we don't care anymore. If that the term racist has very unfortunately, by the way, lost all pull that it once had because it gets thrown around so easily. And I think because of that, anyone that would support immigration reform on the left now feels like, oh man, we can't, because immigration, like reforming immigration would be racist unless it's essentially an open borders policy. And I will say that I think that there are a few progressives who have said, okay, well then we'll do an open borders policy, which I guess would technically be immigration reform. I think it would be insane, and obviously it'll never actually pass that way. But I think that's kind of to blame for Democrats not having a real answer. Another thing that I think is kind of interesting here is the fact that you're exactly right. Like that used to be a pretty big staple in, especially like labor voters' playbook is, hey, migrants come in and they'll take substantially cheaper wages and the jobs automatically go to them. And my libertarian friends would actually be like, yeah, no, cool. We love that. That's great.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
In recent times, when you look at the way that especially on social issues, Hispanic and Latino families tend to vote. It's getting a lot more red, and it's doing it way faster. And along with that, you're also seeing these like first generation, second generation, third generation families voting for stricter border control. And I think that Democrats come across as almost paternalistic when they say, "Oh, well, you don't know what you're talking about." And it's like, well, my family came here illegally. Yes, I absolutely do.
Yeah,
I
and
see
Trump
the
in 2020, Trump increased his share of the vote with Hispanic voters,
yeah,
which I think
and
shocked a lot of people, and black voters actually.
that blew people's minds. And I think there's a lot to. There's so many nuances to that, but part of it absolutely is border issues. I have an uncle. He's obviously not like genetically my uncle, but I've grown up around him. He'll be here in like an hour and a half to like work on his horses, and he just got his green card 5 or 6 years ago, and he was super proud of it and super excited. He ended up spending like I think he said around $36,000 in way pre-COVID money to finally go through everything. And he's a border hawk, despite the fact that he was brought over here when he was 6 years old illegally. He's a massive border hawk. All of his family are border hawks. It's kind of funny when you think about it, but voters are complicated, and I think that too often, neither party really wants to understand that, especially in the context of an overall paradigm shift of, you know, your average blue voter thinks this, and your average red voter thinks this, and I think that the way that the parties coexist with each other has changed so much recently that having this idea of what a Republican voter believes and then looking at what one believed 5 years ago is completely unhelpful. It's maybe
Yeah,
a
I also
starting
think
point, and that's it.
I think both parties are heavily influenced by the donor class, and the donor class on the Democratic side, I think, is a bit more liberal on immigration and border issues than the rank and file voter. And then I think you have similar, not exact, but similar dynamics on the Republican side. Just circling back to the debate, final question on that. Do you have any predictions for who's going to come out on top and potentially be the last man standing against Trump or woman?
Yeah, I think if you look at polling and you look at polling performance, I think that you're gonna have two scenarios. Either they all drop in the last like 2 weeks in order to hopefully let Ron have a shot at beating Trump, or basically everyone stays on and we all know exactly what happens. Trump obviously wins, and then Trump loses. And
You think Trump will lose the general election?
I do. Maybe he won't, but
He's up
like
by a couple points. I saw two recent polls. It's very early, obviously, but in two polls in a row, he was up on Biden.
I think that given the recent the recent trends in like ballot draw boxes, especially the states that Republicans would have to win are becoming rapidly unwinnable for a federal race. And a lot of
Because you think
people,
fraud issues?
I wouldn't even call them fraud issues per se, but I think that when you allow ballot harvesting and one party doesn't, and one party does it and the other party doesn't, the party that does it will win. And this is another place where I really respect DeSantis. Trump tried to hit him about a month or two ago on, oh, well, you've already committed to doing ballot harvesting if you're the nominee. And DeSantis essentially replied, was like, yeah, absolutely. Like, as long as even this is despite the fact that Ron signed a bill in Florida making ballot harvesting illegal. And his response was, yeah, it's a tactic that is incredibly effective. I don't agree with it, but if the other team's going to use it, then I'm absolutely going to utilize it too, because it's the only way. Essentially, like, we have to fight fire with fire was his philosophy, and I think he was completely right on it.
And ballot harvesting is when someone goes around collecting your vote from your house, right?
Yeah, and that's
Like
a
you
little
get
bit of
the
an
ballot mailed to you, and then
yeah.
someone will come and say, "Hello, I'm here to collect your vote."
Yeah. So when COVID occurred, a number of states passed bills essentially saying everyone receives a ballot that's on a voter roll. Like if you're on a voter roll, we'll send you a ballot to your house. You don't opt in for it. You don't have to register to do it, blah, blah, blah. Now you have to be registered in order to submit it and for it to be counted. Absolutely. But the idea from Team Red is essentially, well, if you're not going to put the effort in to do this, 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 and this, it's obvious the goal here is to make it to where someone with zero buy-in basically to the democratic process is still having their vote counted despite not putting in any of the effort to actually vote. There are a lot of things in America that you can own as long as you just do the paperwork, basically. And Republicans have traditionally believed that voting should kind of be the same way. Anyone should be able to vote as long as they're willing to put buy-in into the democratic process. Now, the problem is back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, that was in the form of like a poll tax or a, literacy test or any of these other like super duper racist things. Well, now the idea is basically just Republicans want to say, hey, we want everyone to vote, but we want everyone to understand the value of voting and put a real investment into their democratic future. And if they're not going to do that, then do we really want their vote? And I don't want to put words in the mouths of Republicans as a broader party, but that's kind of how I've always read it from the party.
It's a very generous interpretation of Republican intentions.
It absolutely is. But ballot harvesting essentially cuts most of that effort out. If we just mail everyone a ballot that literally all they've got to do is like fill in a bubble and then drop it at a central location in town, or better yet, have a campaign volunteer come by and collect them. A1. The benefit to having a campaign volunteer doing it is for especially your less informed voters, having a campaign volunteer knock on your door and say, hey, did you vote for so-and-so? And if you say yes, they take your ballot. And if you say no, they take your ballot and they throw it in the trash. Again,
which there's not a lot of evidence of. I'm not a big fan of the practice, but
yeah, admittedly, you sound like a conspiracy theorist when you say that happens. But the fact
I would guess
question exists is, I would argue, an issue. And again, if you're not going to fight ballot harvesting by ballot harvesting, you're not going to win. At least not in the states that allow it.
Yeah, I don't know too much on it, but I've done campaign volunteering before, and I would guess I don't think it's impossible, but I'm a little skeptical of the idea that they go up asking people who they voted for.
Oh yeah, you're not allowed.
But I think they probably have a ton of micro data on, here's Taylor, he's voted in the last 20 different elections. We know he's a registered Republican. His social media indicates that he's very pro-gun. I bet that he's voting Republican, so let's make sure we go to his house.
Yeah.
And then next door to him is someone who's very left-wing. Maybe we don't go to her house. So I don't think they even need to ask. I think there's enough data on most people that you can probably ascertain that based on that data. It's kind of shifting topics. One other issue I wanted to delve into with you is the war in Ukraine. Last night, the government didn't shut down because they passed a continuing resolution, but stripped out Ukraine funding, which had been holding up the continuing resolution in the House. And we were at a point, to quote a Republican congressman, I forget who it was that said it, but we almost shut down the U.S. government over the issue of funding a foreign government. It seems like a majority of the House Republican caucus has turned on Ukraine, or at least is voicing a lot of skepticism on Ukraine. On the Democratic side, you don't see that at all. It's pretty uniform. Does that surprise you at all, that the kind of restraint and, I don't know, I don't want to call it anti-war, but I'll just go back to the restraint on military action, military aid is most prevalent on the Republican side instead of the Democratic side?
Yeah, yes and no. I actually see I see Republicans in the House as a pretty good mirror of your average, if you take every Republican voter and put them up on a pedestal. I think it's a good mix of neocons who didn't get the memo that, like, you guys are out, as well as people
Well, they're all
who,
Democrats now, the
yeah.
neocons.
I used to argue with a former coworker all the time. It wasn't really arguing. I would just say, like, the biggest victory that the neocons ever point to is Trump losing. And he would laugh. It was and he agreed with me. But yeah, it's 100%. It's been so interesting to see It's one of the reasons why when I was younger, one of the things that I actually respected about the Democratic Party is its skepticism towards the war in the Middle East, and moreover, its skepticism toward the military-industrial complex as a whole. Unfortunately, that's just not really there anymore, and it seems like it just was a switch that got flipped. I think Republican opposition to faraway wars is like a really long-term shift in how the party works. I think it's been building for 20 years. Democrats suddenly supporting everything in Ukraine seemed to happen like in the span of like a year and a half. I remember when Ukraine was first invaded, and it
In
was really quiet.
2014
Yeah,
or in 2020?
in 2014, and the only people talking about it were like the McCains of the world, and Democrats just didn't even really reference it at all for the most part. And then it just seemed like overnight, all of a sudden, it's like the talking points memo went out, and all the Democrats were like, "No, we support Ukraine now. Boeing is great. We love them." One of my favorite anecdotes about this, tying it back into ESG, the company that owns Smith and Wesson, I forget their name right now, unfortunately, but it's like Venture Outdoors. And they're a fairly large holding company. They own one or two different firearms and ammo manufacturers, a few camping supply companies, stuff like that. Their ESG scores were, I mean, terrible, absolutely terrible, because they made firearms. And then Ukraine kicked off, and then about 4 months into the U.S. sending arms to Ukraine, all of a sudden the way that that particular ESG framework was being calculated was changed, because, oh, well, yeah, you make guns, but you're sending them to Ukraine, so maybe your ESG score should actually be a little higher. And it bumped it up, and sure enough, they saw a little stock bump from it, from investors that 3 months prior were like, "Oh, you're making weapons of war." They were now saying, "Well, you're making weapons of war," and it's just like the most wild, 180-degree turn that I've ever seen an entire party take, outside of an actual, like, hot war that a country's involved in. Like, it's been crazy, and I actually think that kind of speaks to. I think the change in supporting international involvement on the right is going to be a lot more long term, because the transition to being more opposed to international involvement has taken longer to come about. Whereas on the left, I do think this is going to be kind of a single issue thing. I don't think that the Democratic Party will from now on support military interventionism, and we'll be able to point to Ukraine as the first time we did that. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think Ukraine is just kind of this one weird anomaly that, for whatever reason, the Democratic Party is just like really fixated on. And we'll see how
I don't
that
know if I
goes.
agree with that. I think there is a strong interventionist tinge in the Democratic Party, but it's sort of under the guise of liberal humanitarian intervention. Like, if they dress it up in the language of the Democratic Party values and liberal values, then it seems to be okay with it. I mean, it was under Clinton that the U.S. bombed Kosovo. It was
I
actually
was just about to
NATO.
say, so the 90s Kosovo kind of situation, which is, by the way, going to
Kosovo.
pop off again here in the next few
Yeah,
months, it
yeah.
looks
The
like.
Serbian troops are massing on the border, and interestingly enough, it was NATO that attacked Serbia to peel off Kosovo,
Mhm.
which I think the Russians have pointed to before, that they're nervous about NATO expansion, and it's a bit hypocritical of the United States to say that you can't peel off a region that's ethnically different from a state, when the U.S. had done that in Kosovo.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of Democrats that supported the war in Iraq. Joe Biden among
Mhm.
them, John Kerry among them, Hillary Clinton among them. Under Obama, we, again through NATO, attacked Libya and just kind of left it in wreckage.
Yeah.
And I and there's, intervention going on all over Africa and that sort of thing. So I think there is an interventionist tinge. And then you also have all the neoconservatives who have joined the Democratic Party and been fully embraced. So Bill Kristol and all of them are kind of welcomed in wholeheartedly. So I feel like we might see more of this in the future, but it depends on how Ukraine goes, which doesn't look like it's going well. Have you followed any of the on the ground developments with the counteroffensive?
I was, and then it stalled as heavily as it has. And it seems like all the news that comes out now is just kind of hopium on the part of the Ukrainians or propaganda on the side of the Russians. I've been saying for the past 6 or 7 years that the global zeitgeist, the global state of affairs looks really curiously similar to like right pre-World War One, economically and in terms of like all these super complex treaties and alliances and trade partnerships and stuff like that. And I think that if you look at the current war in Ukraine, it's incredibly similar to how a lot of wars leading up to World War One ended up kind of fizzling into almost like static trench warfare, where everyone is dying and nobody's getting anything out of it.
So in that analogy, I guess China would be Germany, Imperial Kaiser Germany, kind of rising up onto the scene.
Yeah,
What
that's
is
that's
your
probably the best way to look at it. Unless you want to switch sides and say, the Americans are Germany. I'm not saying that at all, but depending upon
well, I
which
would
side of
look
the
at it
conflict you're
more
sitting on.
if it's like a pre-World War One thing, then the US is already the established power the way the British were the established power, at least,
Yeah.
navally. And then the Germans were rising up because they just become a unified state and yada yada yada. What is your take on China? Because that seems to be a big issue on the Republican side. And I know you're not an official Republican, but just on the conservative side, there seems to be an obsession with China. They're kind of the new enemy. There's lots of talk about Taiwan and how we need to defend Taiwan. There's also that on the Democratic side as well. I think Nancy Pelosi was pretty provocative when she flew to Taiwan.
Mm.
Do you share the concern that a lot of people on the Republican Party have on the rise of China?
So I definitely do. I don't share their willingness to necessarily intervene, and I also don't share their skepticism for necessarily the same reasons. So a lot of issues with China are based on more broader, like global power, like who's going to be the hegemon essentially. And my skepticism towards China isn't even remotely baked into that. I don't think China has any desire to be the military world leader. They never have. China, even in the days of Mao, loves their paper tiger strategy, and it's done them so well over the past 80 years.
The paper tiger strategy to look like a
So
paper tiger.
essentially, the way that Mao, the best example I can point to is when Mao developed nukes, he had the capacity to just like pump them out if he wanted. He built like 30 and then just kind of sat on them, and he would like ship them across the country just to like look like, oh yeah, there's all these nukes all over the place. But the CIA rather quickly found out that like, dude, they're sending like the same 5 or 6 nukes around the country, like all these different bases. Like, why are they doing this? And then at the same time, they also got intelligence that showed like, no, they are live nukes. Like, why do they keep moving the same ones? And it became revealed a few years after that. Mao even said it in an address. He was like, no, our goal is to be a paper tiger. Like, we don't need to invest all of this money on having the most effective military in the world when people know essentially they can't come in and take our dirt anyways. Just not give them a reason to fight with us, and everything will be fine. And that's been an incredibly effective strategy for China thus far. I see no reason to oppose China on a military, on a military power basis. My issue with China personally comes more from their cybersecurity flagrants, as well as some of the broader impacts they have to the world of trade. I'm not opposed to their involvement in the global trade conundrum overall. My issue comes more at their willingness to manipulate global trade, because they're in a prime spot to do it and they've got the power to do it and they're willing to do it, just as we have been in the past few years. That's where the hegemon status really comes in my opinion. When it comes to China, is they don't want to be the world's largest military power. They want to be the world's largest economic power. And that's a status that I don't think America can really afford to give them. We don't want to become, Britain circa 1960. And I know a lot of conservatives are basically pointing fingers and saying like, yeah, no, that's what we're going towards. Like, we're going to be these these delusional Brits that are convinced that they still have this global empire, and they're the ones really in charge of global trade, when everyone else in the world knows that's not the case. And for what it's worth, I actually think conservatives that say that are completely correct. I think that we're very rapidly pushing in that direction. Now, the race, in my opinion, that China is currently running is, how long can we live with this supply side economy before it essentially burns us down? It's like taking steroids. Like, steroids are amazing for your body until they're not, and then you die. Or like amphetamines or any other like performance enhancing anything. Like, yeah, it's great until it stops being great, and then it kills you. And I think that the most effective strategy for fighting China on the trade front is essentially give them the rope to hang themselves. Like, make sure that they keep pumping this demand side economy or supply side economy with so much juice that it just becomes untenable. And I think that we're really rapidly getting close to that point. The problem then becomes, well, what happens when they do collapse? Because we also are all relying on their consumption as well as their supply of basically everything we use.
Would you support additional tariffs or maintaining the existing tariffs we have?
That's another hard one. I'm a firm believer in tariffs need to be like a one for one thing. I don't support tariffs in general, but if one country is going to have a tariff X% on Y good, then inevitably, like, it would make no sense if your country didn't also have a tariff for A% on B good. Like, and I think the Trump administration found this out the hard way when they tried to do I think it was the Canadian steel imports or the Canadian
Yeah.
lumber imports or whatever. We tried to limit Canadian steel imports, and Canada was like, whoa, okay, well, we're going to do the same for American lumber or whatever. And that's always what happens with tariffs, in my opinion. Like, no one ever really wins. It's just sort of a tit for tat situation. It's prisoner's dilemma. If everyone would just like talk to each other and be like, look, we know what the end result is going to be. Let's all just like sit in neutral here. Then there wouldn't be a problem. But I don't think I think politicians think that they can game theory, and they've never been able to in the history of mankind. But you can't tell them anything.
What would you do to kind of reshape the country politically if you're able to? Like, what would be a conservative utopia for you if you became a dictator and you could kind of restructure things in this country? I know, obviously, we talked about some of the issues, but would you get rid of regulatory agencies like the FDA and the EPA and the FTC, the FAA?
So I'm gonna pretend I'm like the world's most stereotypical conservative here, and get outside of my specific issues. That's probably where I would start. Is I would start with all of the three-letter agencies. The first one would actually probably be the IRS, and then from the IRS I would go to pretty much everything. Homeland, even. I would do the ATF, obviously, Department of Health, Department of Ed, all of these massive bureaucratic organizations. And then instead of pulling a Vivek, I would take that funding and I would figure out, what's the best way to essentially return this to the states and let them administer solutions that make a lot more sense for their particular areas. I think a great example of this is education funding on the East Coast. Weirdly enough, one of the things that Democrats have really struggled with in terms of charter schools versus public schools is schools in like the Maryland area, especially around like Baltimore, because there are these charter schools that are like majority black students and Democratic voters that are very in support of these charter schools. because it's understood that, and if I remember right, West Wing even had an episode on it in the early 2000s. At the end of the day, the charter schools worked because they were much more tailored to the students that were in them. I think that a lot of states need to have the flexibility to educate and empower students in ways that make sense for them, but don't necessarily make sense for other states. And I think you can kind of copy and paste that philosophy to a lot of issues, including like healthcare funding, environmental issues, even, and a bunch of other stuff.
Well, just to push back on a couple of those. So take environmental issues. What if you have a factory that is polluting into a river that goes from New Hampshire to Massachusetts, for example? In New Hampshire, they say we don't want to have any environmental protections because this is our issue. But the river with all the mercury in it is flowing into Massachusetts and contaminating their drinking water. Wouldn't you need a more that like a federal government to regulate that as opposed to the state issues?
Some sort of, at minimum, interstate tribunal situation. I don't actually support completely destroying all of these agencies. I want to point that out first and foremost, because I do think that there are those issues that, like, I don't think the average conservative supports completely getting rid of them. I think that the average conservative does support gutting them to vastly limit their purview and what they would call overreach. But no, there are going to be situations that happen in one state but affect either one other state or even like 49 other states, or a foreign government even, and all these other issues. And in situations like that, obviously there would be some form of larger framework, some larger organization that would have sovereignty over those particular issues and be able to like work issues out.
Why are conservatives so against the IRS? That's one thing that I don't fully understand, because there's also a traditional conservative issue of wanting to balance the budget, or at least not have large deficits. I don't think that's always worked out in practice. It almost never has. But a stronger IRS, it's not like they're making up tax laws. They're enforcing the tax laws that exist. I think most of the tax evasion is rich people. If they're just collecting money to fund the government, and a looser, weaker IRS means less money going to government. I know the preference for conservatives is a smaller government in general and shrinking the state. But do you do that by allowing people to evade their taxes?
I think conservatives 10 years ago wanted to limit the size and scope of government via legislative wins and policy wins. And I think that they lost every single fight they ever picked. I don't think they succeeded a single time. And increasingly, you're seeing a younger generations of conservatives understand that they won't win that fight, and they never, like, under any circumstances. So instead, we're going to see, well, then let's just cut off their funding and let's let them atrophy at their own pace. I don't think that's necessarily the best solution. I would love to have the policy wins or the legislative wins, but we're not going to win. And if we're not going to win, I mean, if we're not going to win fighting fair, why fight fair? Like, we're not just going to say, oh man, we failed to limit the size and scope of government through Congress and through state governments. I guess we just can't ever limit it. Instead, we're going to say, okay, well then how can we limit it? And if it's by defunding these various agencies, then that's what we're going to do. You're seeing this rapidly pick up steam when it comes to IRS funding. And I'll go back to my immense gun knowledge. There's currently a really big issue of defunding the ATF. In fact, I think it was Representative Clyde pushed for a number of ATF bills that specifically had the intent of defunding the ATF. Not because we want the ATF to like work on a stricter budget, but because we want the ATF to wither away and die.
But then why not have a bill to repeal the, like, just get rid of the ATF?
Because it won't pass. Ever. even if Republicans just had, I mean, a death grip on the House, Senate, and White House, like, it still would never pass.
Why do you think it would not pass if Republicans have a majority and there's a majority willing to defund the ATF, why would they not vote to just get rid of the ATF or drastically reduce it in power?
Yeah,
I mean, it's the same effect
yeah,
when you're taking the vote.
and it's a lot
Is
clearer
it
that way
a,
too.
yeah, is it just a concern of public opinion?
No, it's leadership. It's the same reason that I would argue the majority of Republicans don't want us to be involved in Ukraine, but Kevin McCarthy does.
So then why are they electing Kevin McCarthy as their leader? Actually, he might not last long. I don't know if you saw
I
Gates
hope
is going to do a motion to vacate this week, he said.
I hope that he doesn't. I am a
I hope he
firm
doesn't either.
believer that one of the what's the word I'm looking for here? Sort of distorted reflections of the Republican Party and Democratic Party is Democrats tend to do a much better job at electing leaders that are good Democrats. Republicans do a miserable job of electing Republicans who are good Republicans. If you put Kevin McCarthy on a scorecard of what the average conservative wants, he would be considered like ultra moderate. Republicans don't like that. If you put, we'll use Nancy Pelosi, but you put Nancy Pelosi on a scorecard of what the average Democrat wants, yeah, she'd be considered moderate, but I don't think she'd be considered nearly as moderate of a Democrat as Kevin McCarthy is considered a moderate Republican, if that makes sense. And I think that a lot of that is social issues that neocons still just don't want to touch. Ron Paul was a great example of this, as was Boehner before him. Boehner and Paul, neither of them wanted to really pass legislation on social issues as much as they wanted to talk about it, maybe fundraise on it a little bit, and then make sure to pass some tax cuts.
That seems to be the biggest priority.
Exactly.
So just with a couple minutes left, I wanted to circle back to the horse race stuff. Next year, Donald Trump is under 4 indictments currently. I think 91 counts. I think a lot of them are bullshit, but I don't think they're all bullshit. What do you think happens if Donald Trump is found guilty and then put in jail? Do you think he could still win? Well, actually, I should backtrack that a little because I know you said you don't think he could win. Say vice president or say Joe Biden is not president next year for, let's say, health reasons, and Kamala Harris is the vice president. Does Trump beat her if he's in jail?
I'm not going to make an official guess on this one because every time I've ever done that involving Trump, I've been wrong. On both sides of the coin. You know, when I thought he was gonna lose, he won, and when I thought he would win, he'd lost. So I think Trump would love to be put in a literal prison cell. That would be he would relish that opportunity.
He's a germaphobe, though.
Yeah, much like myself. I don't blame him on that one. There's a reason he showed up for that mugshot in exquisite hair and makeup. I guarantee you he practiced that smug, like, look for hours in front of a mirror. And I don't blame him. I would have done the same thing. He knows the power of that image of him being in a jail cell. He knows the power that would have. And he thinks, whether he's right or not, that would actually help his election chances. Maybe it does. I'm not going to say it won't, because I didn't think he would get elected in the first place. I know a lot of people that have sort of moved on from Trump in the past 2 or 3 years because they think that he just whines about old stuff that's not important anymore. And they've moved on to candidates like Vivek and RDS, usually. I think Trump being in a prison cell would have a heck of an impact on those voters in particular. I think they would immediately go back to supporting Trump, more as a way to protest the government than because they actually want Trump to be the leader. Consider it a protest vote for a candidate that could theoretically actually win.
What do you think would happen? Say Biden is still president and alive next year. It's a very close election, which it probably will be. Biden barely pulls off a victory, and it comes down to he wins in Michigan by 10,000 votes.
Mm.
And there's some shady stuff that people have claimed and Trump rejects the election results.
Results.
What do you think happens then? I mean, do you
Yeah.
think it'll just be a bunch of people protesting and then it's fine because Biden's the incumbent and has control of the government already? Or do you think we'll see mayhem in the country?
I don't think we'll see mayhem. I think that it would basically be just what you said. There would be a lot of protests. People would be angry. Your Ron DeSantis would come out of the woodwork saying, "Look, we told you this is what would happen."
Yeah, he'd be thrilled.
Democrats, if they were smart, could pardon Trump and maybe avoid, a red wave the next cycle. But who knows? But yeah, I don't think we would see mayhem across the country. Like, Trump obviously, opposed the results in whenever. Sorry, I have a cold.
2020.
Right now, yeah, in 2020. It's something about being on your show. I get sick before I go on your show every time. The 2 times I've been.
Hopefully it's not COVID.
It's not. We checked like 3 or 4 times at this point. But no, he objected to the results in 2020 and nothing really happened. I mean, yeah, some spicy boomers like kicked in the doors of Congress, but like in the grand scheme of things, spicy boomers kicking in the doors of Congress is not what I would consider a genuine threat to democracy. I think we would see basically that again.
I agree. All right, Taylor, we are up on time. I appreciate you coming back on the show. I think it'll be an interesting year next year. So would love to have you back on as these political developments continue to play out. But thank you for joining again and being the first repeat guest on Zip Code Zero.
Yeah, man, I am completely honored to do so. I look forward to coming back and talking about how I was wrong in predicting literally everything.
We'll see.